I don't need to tell all of you. I don't need to tell all of you that it took many years and a whole army of troublemakers to make it possible for us to vote this season. I trust everyone has a plan for that. You've either done it or you have a plan for it. And I am always delighted to talk about my two favorite troublemakers and how I came to tell their story. Eliza Kennedy Smith was my grandmother, my father's mother, and Lucy Kennedy Miller was her older sister. And together they were a formidable pair who spent their entire adult lives on a mission, first for women's suffrage, and then to try to bring honesty, integrity, and reason to local government. In the fall of 2018, I found myself as chair of a commission charged with planning Pittsburgh's suffrage centennial celebration. It was a project that came out of the mayor's office. We built a website, we planned a whole series of events, and of course, COVID delayed initially and then ultimately brought an end to most of our plans. One thing that did happen was a documentary produced by Women in Film and Media. It's entitled Trailblazers of the Suffrage Movement, and it included interviews with several suffragist descendants. And for what it's worth, the mayor of Pittsburgh declared September 2020, when we were all in lockdown, as Suffrage Centennial Month, honoring Pittsburgh suffragists. All of this rekindled my interest in the suffrage movement and the role that my family had played in it. And it jump-started me back into researching and writing this story. By the summer of 2019, I found myself recently retired and widowed, and I set about working on the book in earnest. Now, I had promised, I'd chipped away at it for more than a decade. I'd promised my father on his deathbed in 2007 that I would get this story published. When COVID hit, it was not all bad for me. The silver lining was the enforced quietude through those many months of lockdown with my dear beagle, the late great Knox, when I had nothing else to do but research and write. Now, I began by mining the thousands of documents in my family's collection. My family has not thrown away a piece of paper for 150 years. I had my great aunt Lucy's letters home from Vassar from 1898 to 1902. I had love letters back and forth between these two women and their husbands. I had original suffrage literature and correspondence from the League of Women Voters that they headed for more than 40 years. I had tax returns back to 1916 and receipts back to 1907 when my great-grandparents were building their dream home. I had plenty to work with. It goes on and on. But when COVID confined me to home, I supplemented all of those family documents by taking a deep dive into newspapers.com. It's an infinitely searchable database. Some of you may be familiar with it. If you're not afraid of going down a few rabbit holes, I highly recommend it to you. Turns out my two she-devils were in the papers all the time. For months, I relived the entire 80-year saga day by day, as told by journalists in Pittsburgh and beyond. I read thousands of news stories. Now, Annie Dillard had once told me to sit down every day and write, whether the muse was with me or not, but I didn't have to force myself. I couldn't wait to get up every morning and find out what would happen next in contemporaneous accounts. I read about things that had never come to light in any of my research, maybe in anybody's research, and I found corroboration for family stories that I had suspected might be apocryphal. And as I read each news story, I just wove it directly into the narrative. This day-by-day approach enabled me to experience the roller coaster ride that these women were on with each new battle that they waged, repeatedly getting their hopes up and then often having those hopes dashed to the ground. And I like to think that it lends some immediacy to the story. But at any rate, that full immersion was something that only a lockdown would have made possible. This is the first book project I've worked on that was not commissioned, that instead I had to sell. This can be a very humbling process for anybody who's been through it. For over the course of 2 or 3 years, I was repeatedly rejected by agents who said they received hundreds of unsolicited submissions every day. As one agent told me, everyone became an author during COVID. Ultimately, I gave up on the agent and the commercial press route and ended up going the university press route. And after a couple of flirtations with other university presses, ended up with CMU. The story combines several of my passions: history and biography, architecture, urban development. And I've always loved to research, especially with primary sources, and to write, and especially to tell stories. But I never considered that I had the imagination to write fiction. And besides, history hands us so many great stories, way better than any I could have dreamt up. So I have found myself over the years of my work drawn to telling true stories about real people and real places, but always with one question in the back of my mind. So what? Why should anybody care about this story? What makes it relevant? How can I make it a good read? As Zadie Smith says, read your own work as a stranger would, even better, as an enemy would. Now, my father had done a fair amount of chronicling of our family, including a biography of my grandmother, but he was writing about his own mother. And while I was writing about two women who were both dead and gone by the time I was 8. So I had the advantage of a bit more objectivity. And while he could be prone to hyperbole and sometimes a little loose with the facts, I was committed to getting it accurate. And I did as much research as I could and tried to get as many different perspectives as I could. Writing this book felt to me like a calling, like something I was supposed to do, like something no one else was better suited to or more committed to. And it felt like a story that demanded to be told. In the course of telling it, a couple things happened that have changed my relationship with my family. First, after 80 years of estrangement, stemming from a lawsuit between Lucy and Eliza and two of their brothers, the Kennedy clan has been knitted back together.
Wow.
Dozens of cousins, all joined together through the magic of Ancestry.com and through the power of forgiveness. Second, I became intimately acquainted with some of my forebears, including my grandmother here holding me on her lap just months before she died. I learned not only the strengths that I'd always heard about, but I learned something about their weaknesses. I learned that these fearsome she-devils and their families had tender sides, that they were capable of great affection, of insecurity and vulnerability, that they could at times be unfair and unforgiving. In other words, that they were profoundly human. In my dining room, there's a portrait of my great-grandmother, Jenny Eliza Kennedy, who was the mother of these two women. She'd always been hanging in other homes way high above fireplaces, looking down at us with that sort of intimidating gaze. But she now hangs closer to eye level, and knowing her as I do, I see her differently, as more of an authentic presence with all her quirks and flaws. And I even think if you look closely, there's a bit of a Mona Lisa smile, maybe a hint of the hilarious stories she might tell if only that portrait could speak. Now about the title. Arguably, it was a dangerous choice, since a Google search of titles containing she-devils brings up books about serial killers and fetishes, novels in the high heels and handcuffs genre. In my book, it doesn't appear, the term she-devils doesn't appear until chapter 19, but I think it captures the gist of the whole story. And I think they would have approved. Once during a scuffle with local officials over the inefficiency of the police department, Eliza was quoted as saying, "I hear the politicians are laughing at us. I don't doubt it, but we have only begun to scratch the surface." These women were relentless and tenacious, and they embraced controversy. I think She-Devils captures them well.
Beautiful.
Story, as those of you who have read it, and thank you for that, begins with the making of these two women who were the daughters of Julian and Jenny Eliza Kennedy. Julian designed Andrew Carnegie's blast furnaces and went on to have a successful international practice as a consulting engineer. He designed, for instance, the Tata Steelworks in India, parts of the Panama Canal, even the surviving steel mill outside Mariupol, Ukraine. And his success in business enabled the family to live the good life. They had 5 children, and the oldest and the next to the youngest were girls who became inseparable despite the decade between them. Some would even come to call them political twins. Lucy, the older, was the more outgoing with an outrageous sense of humor. She was the bold, brash one, and Eliza was more reserved, but she had a biting wit of her own. And when either one of these women spoke, people listened. Both of them.
Eliza, if you've changed slides, we're still seeing the cover of the book.
Oh,
Is
yeah,
that
slides a long time ago. Okay. Did you ever see anything other than the cover?
when we first
Yeah.
started, you had the shot of the 2 of them side by side,
Right.
and then I believe a larger family.
Okay, let's see. Then that, did you see that one?
No,
That's,
still the cover.
oh, okay, let me try this. How about that?
There we go.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Just to
No,
catch
that's
up.
terrific.
Here's the documentary film, my mountains of paper, and my dog
Oh,
got
sweet
me
man. What a great
through-
picture.
through COVID. They were always in the newspapers. And here's my Kennedy clan on one of our many Zoom calls. We're planning a family reunion. Me with my grandmother.
That is such a precious photo.
The portrait in my dining room. The title, and now I think we're caught up.
Perfect.
Are we? Okay. So, you're seeing Vassar?
We are.
I'm glad
My
you told me.
goodness.
You could have been sitting there looking at the cover the whole time. So both of these girls earned degrees from Vassar, Lucy in 1902 and Eliza in 1912. There they were exposed to progressive thinking and an educational philosophy that encouraged students to ferret out the truth. They did debate in college, but otherwise they were not trained as political strategists or lobbyists, as fundraisers or major event planners. They were just self-taught disruptors with a passion for justice and equality and a desire for integrity in government. And then after Vassar, they both came back to Pittsburgh to lead the women's suffrage movement here. Now, both of these women would readily admit that when they started out, they were rather green, that they had to learn as they went. In fact, one of the notable things about the group is they gathered a group of 8 in my great-grandparents' living room in 1909. 7 of them were under the age of 31. And a number of those went on to hold state and national positions. This was a movement of all ages, and the real action in Pittsburgh was led by very young women. The African American community also took up the gauntlet for suffrage about the same time as the Equal Franchise Federation was launched in Pittsburgh. The Lewendai Literary and Social Club, which was a refuge for the city's Black elite, held a symposium where they debated the topic, shall women participate as auxiliaries or as subordinates or as a separate organization to the white organizations. This led to the formation of 2 different leagues in Pittsburgh, which were very active. Lucy and my Lucy and her colleagues were frequent speakers at these clubs, which had access to a whole other constituency of men. And these women, like their white counterparts, would attend the national conventions and parades and then bring the message back to local churches and clubs and homes in what they called echo meetings. And Daisy Lampkin in particular was notable because she went on to hold a national position with the NAACP. Ultimately, this was the work of people from all walks of life, including many men, sometimes called suffragents. And it brings me to the topic of terminology. The activists, both men and women, who campaigned for women to get the vote are known as suffragists. You often hear people talking about suffragettes, which was actually considered by some to be a derogatory term. It was reserved for those women primarily in England, but also in this country as well, Alice Paul being perhaps the most notable, who resorted to more violent and militant tactics to get their message across. The suffragettes were the women who were breaking windows, blowing up buildings, going on hunger strikes, even burning a 3-foot paper likeness of Woodrow Wilson over a blazing cauldron in front of the White House. The Pittsburgh suffragists disapproved, and Lucy even wrote a letter to the president saying so. They would have been, my two would have been insulted to be called suffragettes. This story could be considered local, but I think it's important to note that it's emblematic of the entire suffrage movement, which took place as a grassroots movement in towns and cities all over the country. The larger movement is a huge one, and you might say it began as early as the Revolutionary War times, when First Lady Abigail Adams wrote to her husband lobbying for consideration for women. If particular care and attention is not paid to the women, she wrote, we are intent to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound to obey any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Most would say that the formal beginning of the movement was 1848, which was, of course, the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, where suffrage was just one plank in a much larger platform. And then after that, there were multiple attempts to get a federal amendment, the first being forwarded by a senator in California in 1878. At the same time, it was a subject that was left largely to the states. Wyoming was the first to enfranchise women in 1869, followed by Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. So that by the time the movement really took hold in Western Pennsylvania and the state of Pennsylvania in 1909, there were actually two parallel movements going on, one for a state amendment and one for a federal amendment. And that continued all the way through. Along the way, our intrepid suffragists met with their fair share of resistance. The Pittsburgh Association opposed to women's suffrage was largely made up of women who became known as the antis. They referred to the suffragists as the suffs, and they dismissed them as a cult and a bluff. The antis insisted, among other things, that suffrage hadn't benefited women in the states where they could vote, that women in politics posed a threat to society and the home, but the whole suffrage movement encouraged a state of hysteria and unrest, and that women were already adequately represented by their fathers, their brothers, their husbands, and their sons. And they also pointed out a terrible consequence that could come of women's suffrage. God forbid women serving on juries. Now, these antis would continue to do battle with the suffragists long after the amendment was passed. In fact, in Pittsburgh, the one-time leader of them on her deathbed in 1935 still insisted that women's suffrage had been a mistake.
Goodness.
Be spectacular. This was the advice of this young woman, Edna Cotter from Kansas City, who in 1912, at the age of 27, gave a speech in Chicago that made headlines in Pittsburgh. Be spectacular, she said, so as to obtain brilliant vermilion headlines. Taking her advice to heart, the Pittsburgh suffragists became brilliant tacticians. They came up with all kinds of strategies. And in fact, the whole story of the suffrage movement in this region unfolds like so many spectacular, at least memorable scenes in a movie. Now, my dream, and I'm still working on this, is for She Devils at the Door to make it to the silver screen. So I would invite you to picture just a few of those cinematic scenes. Picture a bustling city newspaper office in 1912. It's February 29th, Leap Day, a day recognized as a time to turn the tables on traditional gender norms, the one day when it's considered acceptable for a woman to propose marriage to a man. On this day, February 29th, 1912, 16 suffragists march into the offices of the Pittsburgh Sun newspaper by invitation from the owners. And by the end of they take over the whole operation, from editorial to production to distribution. And by the end of the day, they've produced a special suffrage edition. From the first page to the last, this is a paper by and about women. Now picture Euphemia Bakewell clutching her one-day membership card in the International Printing and Pressmen's Union so she can go down into the press room and pull the lever that starts the presses running. And then picture hundreds of women taking to the streets to sell their special edition, which at the time boasts the highest circulation in the paper's history.
You go, girls.
Picture a building. Stacy, you said you're from Pittsburgh. You may or may not remember the Jenkins Arcade, which was on the site of where Fifth Avenue Place is in Pittsburgh. This was a multi-story office and retail arcade, and the Equal Franchise Federation had its offices on the top floor. Picture this building when it was a fairly new building in 1914. It's May 2nd, 1914, Suffrage Day. And on this day, 2,000 marchers, 500 of them men, spill out of the Jenkins Arcade and join a motorcade of more than 100 cars festooned with yellow bunting and flowers and flags and banners. And they make their way around downtown to a vacant lot where Henry Clay Frick's Union Trust building will soon be built. There are 30 orators, sometimes 6 at a time, speaking from soapboxes and running boards of cars. The papers described it as something like a 3-ring circus. Lucy and her father are among the speakers, and Lucy introduces resolutions aimed at candidates for the state legislature and the National Senate. And her remarks are met with thunderous applause. Another great cinematic scene. Now picture, for anybody who knows Pittsburgh, this is Flagstaff Hill and Shenley Park. Just picture a big city park with a huge grassy hill, and it's July 4th, 1915, Americanization Day. And hundreds of immigrants are celebrating their new status as enfranchised US citizens. The Justice Bell has just, which is a 2-ton replica of the Liberty Bell, has just finished a statewide tour on the back of a flatbed truck, visiting all 67 counties. The clapper of the bell is bound by chains and padlocks to render it silent, as a symbol that women will be rendered silent until they have the vote. But the bell isn't welcome at this naturalization ceremony. So while it sits elsewhere in town, a group of women in white dresses, caps and gowns, and those sashes that you see everywhere make a stealth approach to the hill, completely surround the crowd, and silently for 15 minutes make their demands known through a series of placards and banners. You can see some of them there. And then just as silently, they go away. Basically,
Wow.
They're asking the immigrants to pay it forward by supporting votes for women. Now, after the amendment was passed on June 4th, 1919, it still had to be ratified by 36 states. And it would be another 14 months before the 36th state, Tennessee, would pass it, would ratify it. Elsewhere in the South, ratification took a little bit longer. Maryland ratified it in 1941, Alabama and Virginia in the 1950s, and Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Louisiana between 1969 and 1971. Then there was Mississippi. They got around to it in 1984, while y'all were still in college.
Good Lord.
After they got the vote, my 2 she-devils spent the next 40 years fighting corruption in local government. They made this their mission, and it was a full-time job. Even before the amendment had been ratified, the Equal Franchise Federation morphed optimistically into the Allegheny County League of Women Voters. And as leaders of the league, Lucy and Eliza were supported by loving husbands, but everyone else was terrified of them. The story goes that they would cross the threshold of our city-county building and the word would go out, the she-devils are at the door. They were nonpartisan in their pursuit of corruption, and politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, learned to take them seriously. Now back to our movie. Picture a dingy, smoky city office in 1930. Our two heroines, now looking a little bit older and a little bit dowdier, are poring over the city's purchasing records, sleuthing out evidence that will lead to the conviction of the mayor on 48 counts of fraud. They become a perpetual thorn in the side of city officials, scrutinizing every budget year after year for waste and inefficiency. And they're constantly in the newspapers, including political ads that sometimes lampooned them as little old ladies in flowered hats, but the fact that they did the cartoons about them suggests just how much of an impact they were having. Now picture Pittsburgh in 1941, dark as night, even at midday. The streetlights were on around the clock. And then picture the ballroom of a grand old hotel, the William Penn, but picture it filled to overflowing with people concerned about the issue of smoke. The city had passed an ordinance, but they weren't getting any traction with enforcing it. So Eliza and her league gathered more than 1,000 people in this ballroom to try and arrive from all perspectives on the issue, to try and arrive at some consensus and cooperation. Finally, picture Eliza leading 200 angry women to the city council chambers to protest the inefficiency of the police department in the wake of two horribly grisly murders that would never be solved. And then picture Eliza and her buddies making surprise visits to the police stations to find out for themselves if things had improved. By the time my grandmother died in 1964, she had become known as the go-to person for complaints about how things were handled or not by public officials. She was eulogized by politicians and journalists as the conscience of Pittsburgh, as a relentless, tenacious watchdog of the city's purse strings who hounded the coattails of politicians relentlessly, both Democrats and Republicans. When my uncle was called to her deathbed, he jumped in a cab downtown and raced across town to the hospital. And as the cab was racing along, it hit a cavernous pothole, and the cabbie, not knowing who my uncle was, just muttered under his breath, "Why doesn't Mrs. R. Templeton Smith do something about that?" So returning to that question of what makes it relevant, I would point out that the parallels are staggering between the world of their world of the first half of the 20th century and our world of today. Like us, they were stopped in their tracks by a viral pandemic. The flu of 1918 infected 4,400 Pittsburghers in the first 2 weeks alone. They had the same sorts of cancellations and closures, the same distancing and masking rules, and even some of the same controversies over compliance. The pandemic put the suffrage movement on hold, but it didn't stop it altogether. The suffragists were sometimes up against police who didn't do their jobs to protect them. Classic example was the parade in 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inaugural parade, which they were not allowed to march in. And the whole thing devolved into utter chaos. The police lost control of the crowd, and it was a a big mess. Both Lucy and Eliza were there. Corruption was rampant in Pittsburgh during their time and beyond, and it was often difficult to gather accurate data and to hold elected officials accountable. It would seem we face those same issues today. Likewise, charges of voter suppression and voter fraud were widespread during their era. Does this sound at all familiar? We still can't seem to agree on the most equitable and the most accurate way to gather votes. Now, I would typically end a talk like this with the question, what's in your attic? What stories are hiding in diaries and journals, in scrapbooks and photo albums and so on. But given the pivotal moment that we're in, I think I have to ask instead, with 7 days left to go, what are you going to do? Now, in the front matter of the book, I quote a New York Times author, Elmer Davis, who wrote a book in 1954, But We Were Born Free. He said, as you can see here, freedom can be retained only through eternal vigilance, which has always been its price. Excuse me. The message is we must pay attention. We must educate ourselves. We must continue to use our hard-won vote as our voice. Securing votes for women was only the beginning of the job. Our work as responsible citizens is really never done. So I will ask again, what are you going to do in these next 7 days? And I will add to that Michelle Obama's stirring charge at the Democratic National Convention. Do something. So thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with what I call MHTs, but which I understand is a term that died out in my era, but it stands for Mount Holyoke types. And I'm glad to have had this time with you tonight.
Eliza, we can't thank you enough. What an absolutely incredible story. And let me get us back to...
Yeah, you can unshare this. Shall we stop the share?
Yeah, there we go.
Thank
I
you
will
so much.
reclaim
What
us
an amazing
and,
thing to find.
just back to where we can all see each other. Yeah. For starters, tomorrow I'll be early voting, but I'm curious to see what other folks have to come up with a new MHT will be doing as well. The
Well,
parallels really
I
are staggering.
I am voting on the day. I'm going to be there at 7 a.m. when the doors open.
Good.
I feel
Good.
strongly that I want to do it in person. I've voted by mail at times, but this one's too important.
This one is critical. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we have
So any questions or comments?
comments. I'm just really astonished. Your story is absolutely magical. But of all the things that you collected in your attic and compiled, what surprised you most about writing the book? A particular
Honestly,
story,
it was getting to know them personally as being sometimes unsure themselves. I mean, Aunt Lucy terrified everybody. I have one second cousin, her oldest grandchild, who I just saw a week ago. He's the only living person who was not terrified of Aunt Lucy. And my grandmother, while she was a little softer, was also pretty intimidating. But in reading their letters and their memoirs, I got to know that they were just regular folks like any one of us who screwed up their courage and just went out and did it. Yeah.
What does your extended family think of the book?
Oh, they're really excited.
I bet. This must be an absolutely wonderful just way to bring your family to life, not just stories
Well,
around
and to
the
bring it
Thanksgiving
together
dinner.
again. I mean, I had cousins I'd never met, and I had cousins I hadn't seen in decades, and now we're all pals again. It's great.
That's terrific.
Wow.
And how did you, again, the volume of information, both physical and, tidied up in folders and then newspapers.com. Did you have a database, or how did you compile and collate all that information?
Well, this is why as I said, as I read each thing in newspapers.com, I wrote it immediately into the manuscript. Because for anybody who does research now, and you're combining the paper and the digital and it in all different forms. And if I had taken notes on all that, I mean, when I was in college, we still were doing it with note cards. I don't know if you all did it that way. Yeah, right. You had the note cards, and the note card had some key
And
to
the-
whatever the
the
source
resource,
was, and then it had
yeah.
an idea, and then you arranged all the note cards, and then you just stacked them up and wrote it. That wouldn't have worked because I was getting things from all different angles, and it would have taken a lot longer. So it was a design build project, if you will. I was researching and writing at the same time.
Sure.
And that's what worked for me. And the other really good news is that I have a new attic, and it's called the Archives of the Heinz History Center.
Oh, wonderful.
They are taking all this so that I don't have to worry about my kids keeping it.
That's
Perfect.
great.
That was
what
my
I
next
was-
question. Like, how was this being
Mine too, like how
protected?
to save all these lovely papers and the physical stuff, like how is that going to be preserved? Wonderful.
They're taking it, which is
Aw,
a huge
Good.
relief to me.
yeah,
Of course.
And
Well,
they know how to take care of it.
Mhm.
I imagine. Yeah.
Right.
Well, speaking of note cards, what, or which, I should say, of the Mount Holyoke professors inspired you? Who were early cheerleaders of
I
what you
have
were
to
doing
tell
and
you, it
moved you
was
on
a
the
high
line?
school teacher.
Yeah?
It was my AP US history teacher, John Canning, who's still alive and occasionally comes to a book signing
Oh, wonderful.
from 50 years ago. And he taught me to do primary research, which I have always loved. I love just digging in and looking at original documents. When I was doing this in high school, you could still read the 19th century newspapers in their original hard copy format.
Oh, wow.
They had them bound in these huge volumes, and I would sit there. I'd go to the library on a Saturday and just sit there all day long reading these newspapers. And the beauty of that is you're seeing not only the stuff that you want to see, but you're seeing the whole context of the time and the place all around it.
Right.
What other things are going on, what kinds of crimes people are committing, what kinds of dresses they're buying, what kinds of theater they're going to. And it really helps to bring a time alive.
I need to get out more.
Well, I'll tell you, not being able to get out was what got me to finish this book. So
Also
I
true.
imagine.
And
Yeah.
what a difference too,
sometimes
having
being
everything
at home is not a bad thing.
True, especially with the internet where everything can come to your door,
Yeah.
in
Well,
your
it was-
fuzzy pajamas.
And it was a time of transition for you too, like you said, if you were newly widowed and so there's a lot going on. So that was a way to maybe distract and then manage grief and things too. So, well,
Mhm.
Kudos, yeah.
Yeah.
Eliza,
Any other questions?
yeah, I do. I guess you were going to ask that, Brooke. Eliza, I have been working on my family history for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, and I'm starting to actually write some of it, not for publication. And the people I'm writing about are not, they're not accomplished. Some of them are in the paper, and my grandfather was in the paper for all kinds of scandals, which not exactly what I want to write about. But I'm wondering, these are people I've never met. I never met my grandfather. He died 10 years before I was born. And I'm wondering how you knew you were done. Like, how did you know that you had captured these women?
Well, I read literally there were thousands of documents that I had, and I read all those, and then I did the search through newspapers.com for 80 years up until my grandmother died. And I figured then I knew it was done. Then I had to go back and sort of massage it. And the thing that I was really longing for was a good editor who could come alongside me and say, oh, you lost the storyline over here, you got too deep into the weeds over there. Nobody does that anymore unless you hire separately an editor. What an editor does at a press is basically copy edit. So that was a little frustrating because I thought maybe somebody objective could help me tighten it up. But to you, I would say, everybody's got a story, and every story is interesting if you tell it right. And finding information, if you don't have a pack rat family like mine, or they weren't in the papers a lot, is trickier. What I did not have the opportunity to do because everybody was dead and gone was oral history. And that's something I would encourage any of you to do with any of your relatives while they're still around. Even if you just ask them 5 questions, just get something from them that you can hang on to and then share with your kids and grandkids and so on.
Are your children interested in following some of the archival work that you've done?
Well, they love the book, and they love the book tour. And so my oldest son in particular, who's the only one who lives here in Pittsburgh, and I do talks elsewhere. I've been to Florida a couple times, and Massachusetts and New York and Maryland, but he comes to everyone he can. I don't know how many times he's heard it, but he comes all the time. The first one I gave was to the Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures Made Local series. And that, for some reason, drew 330 people. Very first talk. And, I didn't have it down pat yet. And I walk in, and there's this hall full of people. And, I think it went really well. And at the end, they were taking questions, and they're running the microphone up to their lights were in my eyes. I couldn't even see half the crowd. And they're running the microphone up the steps to the very top of the top balcony. And I hear, "I have a question, Mom." I didn't even know he was there.
Hey, family support is a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it is. Well,
questions from anyone else?
Eliza, from the time you intended to write it, and when you finally published, what was that time period? Years? How many years?
15, probably. But you have to understand, I would pick it up and I dive in. I get really interested, but I'd be reading the love letters. And so I was working full time. My husband was very sick, but I would come home and I would read and get all caught up in that. And then, one of my parents would die, and then the other parent died. And then I'd work for a month or 2, and then I'd drop it for sometimes a year or 2, and then pick it up again. And this notion of sitting down every day and making yourself write something or read something, even if what you write is terrible, just making that a part of your routine, I think is important to keeping the ball rolling.
Amen to that.
And I would also suggest, if you're going to do this, that you think about the elements of good fiction that you like. What writers do you like, and what do they do with plots and characters and settings and storylines and suspense and foreshadowing and all the elements of a good story you can bring to bear on the writing of your story.
Sure.
Even without fictionalizing it.
Well, as you said, every family has
Everybody's got
something. Yeah.
Well, thank you all. It's fun to be with you.
Eliza, thank you. What an
Likewise.
absolutely inspirational, marvelous
much.
chat.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for your time,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night.
and happy voting.
Yeah.
Yes, happy
Yes.
voting.
Yes.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Brooke, for organizing.
Thank you all for joining. Appreciate it.
Thank
Take
you.
care.